Neon red letter O in the broken spoke sign flickered with a rhythmic buzz that sounded like a dying insect against the humid Texas night air. It was the kind of sound that usually signaled comfort, a promise of cold beer sawdust floors, and the honest scrape of boots against worn wood. But tonight that image was just a memory, a fleeting ghost in the mind of the man sitting in the back of a polished black limousine, navigating the concrete labyrinth of downtown Houston. George Strait looked out the tinted window, his blue eyes reflecting the passing streetlights, but seeing only the distance between where he came from and where he was going. He adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo, a garment that felt more like a straitjacket than formal wear. The air inside the vehicle was chilled to a sterile 68 degrees, smelling faintly of lemon polish and the expensive leather of the seats. It was a long way from the smell of brisket and stale tobacco that permeated the walls of the broken spoke, but tonight was not about comfort. Tonight was about duty. The limousine slowed as it approached the entrance of the Grand Crystal Hotel, where the Oil and Tech Future Gala was in full swing. A red carpet bled out from the revolving brass doors, flanked by velvet ropes and security guards who looked more like paramilitary operatives than event staff. Photographers swarmed the barricades, their flashbulbs erupting in stroboscopic violence every time a car door opened. George took a deep breath, the same way he used to, before nodding for the gate to open on a chute with a 2,000-pound bull. This arena was different, though. The horns here were hidden behind smiles, and the hooves were replaced by sharp words and sharper lawyers. He was here because they had promised a donation, a massive check that would fund the new rehabilitation wing for wounded veterans at the ranch. For that, he would wear the monkey suit. For that, he would sing the songs. For that, he would endure the sharks. The door opened and the humidity of Houston hit him, first followed immediately by the wall of noise. Screaming fans were drowned out by the shout of paparazzi, calling his name not with affection, but with the hunger of hunters spotting prey. George tipped his black resistal hat, the brim casting a shadow over his eyes, shielding him from the worst of the glare. He moved with that signature gait, a slow, deliberate walk that could not be rushed by publicists or schedule keepers. He offered a polite smile, a tightening of the lips that passed for a greeting, and made his way into the lobby. Inside, the air was perfumed with thousands of dollars worth of lilies and the metallic scent of ambition. The ballroom was a cavern of crystal chandeliers and gold leaf, filled with the new royalty of Texas. These were not the cattle barons of old, who sealed deals with a spit and a handshake. These were the crypto kings, the app developers, the hedge fund managers who viewed the land not as soil to be worked, but as assets to be leveraged. George was ushered backstage through a maze of corridors by a nervous young woman with a headset, who spoke into it constantly, never making eye contact with the legend walking 2 paces behind her. The backstage area was a hive of frantic energy. Makeup artists chased influencers, sound technicians argued over frequencies, and catering staff moved like terrified gazelles through a savanna of predators. It was here in this chaos that George saw him. A young waiter no older than 25 stood frozen near a towering stack of champagne flutes. His hands were shaking. He was pale, a sheen of cold sweat on his forehead. A large man in a tuxedo with a face flushed from too much scotch was leaning over the boy, pointing a thick finger into his chest. The man was shouting about a spilled drop of water on his Italian leather shoe. The waiter, whose name tag read Elias, looked ready to collapse. He was trying to apologize, but the words were stuck in his throat. George stopped. The young woman with the headset kept walking for 10 feet before realizing the king had anchored himself to the floor. George watched the interaction, his eyes narrowing. He saw the way Elias stood, the specific rigidity in his posture, despite the fear. It was the stance of a soldier standing at attention while being dressed down. George changed his course, ignoring the frantic gestures of his handler, and walked straight toward the confrontation. The large man was mid-sentence, threatening to have Elias fired and blacklisted from every catering company in the state, when a hand settled on his shoulder. It wasn't a shove, it was just a presence, a heavy, calm weight. The man spun around, ready to unleash his fury on the intruder, but the words died in his mouth when he saw who it was. George Strait stood there, towering not in height, but in sheer gravity. He didn't look at the rich man, he looked at Elias. He looked at the boy's shoes, which were cheap, well-worn, and polished to a mirror shine despite their age. He looked at the slight tremor in the boy's left hand. George smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners of his face. He reached out and adjusted the boy's crooked bow tie. "You doing all right, son?" George asked, his voice a low rumble that cut through the ambient noise of the kitchen. Elias blinked, tears of humiliation welling in his eyes. He nodded, unable to speak. George patted him on the shoulder. "You served, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. Elias swallowed hard and found his voice. "Marines, sir. 3rd Battalion." George nodded slowly. "Semper Fi, son. You ignore this man. You are doing a fine job. Keep your head up. We need good men like you guarding the flank." George then turned his gaze to the rich man. The silence that stretched between them was heavy enough to crush a diamond. George didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just looked at the man with an expression of mild disappointment, the way a father looks at a child who has disappointed him not by accident, but by character flaw. The man turned a shade of crimson that clashed with his expensive tie, muttered something unintelligible, and retreated quickly into the ballroom. George gave Elias one last nod and turned back to the handler, who was now looking at him with wide eyes. He didn't explain. He just gestured for her to lead the way. He had a job to do. The dressing room was sterile, filled with a fruit basket he wouldn't touch, and bottles of water that cost more than a gallon of gas. George sat on the small sofa and picked up his guitar. It was an old friend, a wooden vessel of memories that felt warm and alive in his hands, unlike everything else in this building. He strummed a G chord, letting the vibration travel through his ribs. It centered him. He thought of the ranch. He thought of the horses grazing in the twilight. He thought of the veterans who would benefit from this night. That was the anchor. He wasn't singing for these suits. He was singing for the men and women like Elias. Out in the ballroom, the lights dimmed. A voice that sounded like it had been synthesized by a computer announced him. "Ladies and gentlemen, the king of country, George Strait." The applause was polite. It lacked the raucous, soulful roar of a rodeo crowd. It was the applause of people who were clapping because they knew they were supposed to, not because they felt it in their blood. George walked out into the spotlight. The heat of the lights was familiar, even if the coldness of the room was not. He adjusted the microphone stand, took a breath, and launched into the opening riff of Deep in the Heart of Texas. The first half of the set was a battle. The acoustics in the ballroom were terrible, designed for speeches, not music. The sound bounced off the glass and marble, creating a muddy echo. But George was a professional. He found the pocket, he found the rhythm, and he delivered. He played Check Yes or No and saw a few heads bobbing. He played Troubadour and saw a few wives singing along while their husbands checked stock prices on their watches. It was hollow work, but he poured his soul into it anyway, because that is what a craftsman does. Then came the shift. It was subtle at first. George was transitioning into the chair, a ballad that usually commanded absolute silence. He closed his eyes for a brief second, losing himself in the melody. When he opened them, the atmosphere had curdled. The air in the room felt different, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. He looked out at the front row. A woman in a silver dress was staring at her phone, her hand covering her mouth. The man next to her was whispering aggressively into the ear of his neighbor, pointing at the stage. George frowned slightly but kept playing. Maybe a fight had broken out. Maybe the stock market had crashed. He moved to the chorus, but the disturbance grew. It spread like a virus, moving from the front tables to the back of the room in waves of blue light. Smartphones were being raised, not to capture the music, but to confirm something. He saw faces illuminated by screens glowing with a ghostly pallor. The polite bobbing of heads had stopped. The murmurs grew louder, competing with the sound system. At table 4, right near the stage, sat a man George had noticed earlier, Julian. He was a blogger, a man who made his living destroying reputations for clicks. He was young, wearing a suit that was too tight and sneakers that cost more than a horse. Julian was grinning. It was a predatory grin. He was holding his phone up, facing the crowd, showing them something on the screen. He then turned the phone toward the stage, recording George with a look of triumph. George felt a knot form in his stomach. He had faced angry drunks. He had faced storms. He had faced grief. But this was different. This was a silent, invisible assault. The song ended. There was no applause. Just a heavy, suffocating silence broken only by the sound of whispering and the notification chimes of 3,000 phones receiving the same message at the same time. George stepped back from the microphone. What is going on, he thought. He looked to the side of the stage. His manager was arguing with someone on the phone, his face pale as a sheet. The stage manager was frantically making the cut it motion, drawing his hand across his throat. But George didn't cut it. He stood his ground. He looked down at the stage floor where a monitor was set up for the teleprompter. Usually it showed lyrics, but the technician, a young kid who was likely panic scrolling, had inadvertently mirrored his laptop screen to the monitor. There it was, in massive red letters on a news aggregator site. The words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He stopped breathing. The guitar felt suddenly heavy around his neck, a dead weight pulling him down. Fraud, stolen, veterans, the three words that were the antithesis of his entire existence. He read the sub-headline. Leaked documents allege the country legend funneled donation money into personal offshore accounts. George Strait, the man who had shaken hands with presidents and paupers alike, felt the blood drain from his face. He looked up. The audience was no longer a crowd of indifferent rich people. They were a jury, and they had already delivered the verdict. He saw the disgust in their eyes. He saw the judgment. A man in the second row stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out, shaking his head in theatrical disappointment. Others followed. The room began to spin. The heat of the spotlight felt like an interrogation lamp. He was frozen. His fingers were locked on the fretboard of his guitar, unable to move. He felt naked. 40 years of building a legacy brick by honest brick, and it was being dismantled in seconds by a lie traveling at the speed of light. He thought of his wife back home. She would be seeing this. He thought of his grandchildren. He thought of Elias, the waiter he had just encouraged. What would Elias think? That the man who patted him on the shoulder was a thief? A hypocrite? The silence on stage was deafening. The band behind him had stopped playing, confused and terrified, looking at their own phones. The whispers from the crowd grew into a dull roar of accusation. Someone shouted something from the back. It sounded like, "Pay it back!" George stood there in the center of the crystal ballroom, a cowboy surrounded by wolves, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. The digital world had crashed into his analog soul, and the impact was catastrophic. He felt the urge to run, to drop the guitar, and walk off the stage into the darkness, to retreat to the ranch and lock the gate, but his boots felt nailed to the floor. The accusation was so vile, so diametrically opposed to his heart, that his brain couldn't process a defense. He just stared at the red letters on the monitor. Cancelled. The word blinked at him. A digital brand burned into his reputation. Julian the blogger was now standing on his chair, filming George's reaction, broadcasting the confusion and the pain to millions of viewers live. The caption on his stream read, "The king is dead. Watch him realize it." George's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a cold sweat break out under his hat. The world was watching him bleed, and he didn't even know where the wound was. The silence stretched a second, turning into an hour. The hum of the air conditioner, the buzz of the phones, the whispers, they all merged into a frequency of pure panic. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, in a room full of people. The silence that had fallen over the crystal ballroom was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. George Strait stood center stage, his hand still frozen over the sound hole of his guitar. The red letters on the monitor at his feet seemed to pulse, growing larger with every beat of his heart. Fraud, thief, liar. The words swam in his vision, blurring into a crimson haze. For a man who had made a career out of stoicism, out of the quiet dignity of a tipped hat and a half smile, this was a violence he didn't know how to parry. In the rodeo arena, you knew the danger. You could see the bull's muscles bunch. You could smell the animal fear and rage. You could prepare. But this was a phantom assassin. It was an attack on his soul, launched from the safety of a touchscreen by people who had never calloused their hands on a day's work. His manager, a good man named Frank, who had been with him since the honky-tonk days in San Marcos, was now at the side of the stage. Frank was waving his arms, his face a mask of panic. He was mouthing the words, "Come off! Get off the stage, George! Now!" George saw him. He understood the logic. The PR strategy was already forming in Frank's mind. Retreat, issue a statement, let the lawyers fight the fire, go into hiding until the news cycle churned out a new victim. That was the modern way. That was the safe way. George took a step back. His boot heel scraped against the stage floor, a harsh sound amplified by the sensitive microphone. He looked toward the wings. The darkness of the backstage area offered safety. It offered an escape from the thousands of eyes that were currently dissecting him, stripping him of his honor layer by layer. He could just walk away. He could retire. He had enough money. He didn't need this. But then, his eyes drifted past the blinding glare of the spotlights and settled on the shadows near the kitchen entrance. He saw Elias. The young waiter was standing there, holding a tray of dirty dishes. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at George. And on the boy's face there wasn't judgment. There was confusion, yes, but underneath it was a desperate plea. Elias looked like a man watching his father figure crumble. He looked like a soldier watching his general surrender without firing a shot. Semper Fi, George had told him, always faithful. A memory hit George then, sharp and clear as a bell. He was 10 years old, back on the family ranch in Pearsall. He had accidentally left a gate unlatched, and a prize heifer had gotten out and broken her leg in a ravine. He had wanted to hide. He had wanted to run into the brush and stay there until nightfall, but his father had found him. His father hadn't yelled. He had simply handed George a rifle and a shovel. "You don't run from your messes, son," his daddy had said. "You look 'em in the eye, and you handle 'em. A man is only as good as his worst day." This was his worst day. The paralysis in George's chest began to crack. The ice of fear melted, replaced by a slow-burning heat. It wasn't rage, it was something older. It was the ironclad stubbornness of the Texas soil. In the audience, the murmurs were turning into heckles. The spell of the king was broken. "Is it true?" a woman's voice rang out shrill and piercing. "Did you steal from the soldiers?" "Pay it back!" a man shouted from the back, emboldened by the darkness. And there, at table 4, was Julian. The blogger was practically vibrating with adrenaline. He was typing furiously on his phone, live tweeting the downfall. He looked up, locking eyes with George. Julian smirked, a smug, self-satisfied twist of the lips that said, "I got you. You're old, you're obsolete, and I just took your crown." Julian raised his glass of champagne in a mock toast to the stage. That was it. That was the spark. George Strait didn't walk off the stage. He walked forward. He moved with a sudden, deliberate energy that startled the band. He unclipped the guitar strap and swung the instrument around his back, letting it hang there like a shield he no longer needed. He reached out and grabbed the microphone stand. His grip was so tight his knuckles turned white. He ripped the mic from the clip. The feedback squealed, a high-pitched shriek that made the audience wince and cover their ears. It was an ugly sound, a raw sound. It cut through the polite murmur of the ballroom like a chainsaw. George didn't apologize for the noise. He waited. He waited until the feedback died down, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. He stood tall, his chest expanded, his chin lifted. He wasn't the entertainer anymore. He was the rancher. He was the grandfather. He was the man. "Kill the spots," George said. His voice was low, but it boomed through the massive speaker array with a terrifying authority. The lighting technician, caught off guard, hesitated. "I said," George repeated, his voice dropping an octave hard as granite, "kill the spotlights and turn on the house lights. All of them. Now." There was a scramble in the tech booth. A second later, the blinding white beams that had been isolating George snapped off. Simultaneously, the chandeliers and overhead floods of the ballroom roared to life. The effect was instant and exposing. The protective darkness of the audience was ripped away. Suddenly, the hecklers weren't faceless voices in the dark. They were people in tuxedos and gowns, squinting in the sudden brightness, looking exposed and foolish. The woman who had shouted looked down at her lap. The man who had yelled, "Pay it back," suddenly found his drink very interesting. The dynamic had shifted. George could see them, every single one of them. He scanned the room, his blue eyes sweeping across the sea of tables like a lighthouse beam, searching, assessing. He stopped when he found table 4. "You," George said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The word hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. He raised a finger, pointing directly at Julian. Julian froze, his champagne glass halfway to his mouth. He looked around, hoping George was pointing at someone behind him, but there was no one behind him. "Yeah, you." The boy in the tight suit with the phone glued to his hand, George continued. The camera crews, sensing the shift, swung their lenses from the stage to table 4. Julian's face appeared on the giant screens flanking the stage. He looked small. He looked sweaty. The arrogance was evaporating, replaced by the deer-in-headlights panic of a bully who has been punched back. George took a step closer to the edge of the stage, the toes of his boots hanging over the void. "My manager tells me there's a story going around, a story you started." George paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. The room was dead silent. Not a fork clinked against a plate. "You got a name, son?" George asked. Julian swallowed hard. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He cleared his throat. "Julian," he squeaked. Then, remembering his online persona, he tried to muster some bravado. He stood up, puffing out his chest. "I'm Julian Banks. I run the Truth Feed." "The Truth Feed," George repeated, tasting the words as if they were sour milk. "Well, Julian from the Truth Feed, it seems you know an awful lot about my bank accounts. You seem to know more about my business than I do." George began to pace slowly along the edge of the stage, never breaking eye contact with the blogger. "You told all these fine folks here that I took money meant for wounded boys and girls. You told them I bought racehorses with it. The documents," Julian stammered, his voice gaining a little strength as he played to his live stream audience. "The documents are leaked. It's all there. You can't deny the transaction logs," the crowd murmured. Julian felt a surge of confidence. He had the data. Data didn't lie. George stopped pacing. He looked at Julian with a mixture of pity and steel. "Transaction logs," George mused. "Numbers on a screen. That's your world, isn't it, son? Zeros and ones, shadows and whispers." George reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate. The audience held its breath. Was he pulling out a statement? A lawyer's card? A resignation? He pulled out a piece of paper. It wasn't a crisp, typed document. It was a small, crumpled yellow carbon copy slip. The kind you get from a bank teller in a small town. The kind that smells of ink and paper. George held it up. It looked insignificant in his large hand. "You see," George said, his voice softening, becoming conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. "I'm an old-fashioned man. I don't do online banking. I don't trust the cloud. When I move money, I look a person in the eye and I sign my name." He looked at the paper, then back at Julian. "You want to talk about the truth, Julian? You want to be a big man and destroy a life for a few likes on your little website?" George's voice began to rise, the gravel turning into thunder. "Well, don't stay down there in the safety of the floor. If you're going to call me a thief, you come up here and say it into this microphone. You look me in the eye and you tell me I stole from the men who defend this country." George gestured to the stairs at the side of the stage. "Come on up, son. Let's compare your leaked documents with what I have in my hand. Right now." The challenge hung in the air, electric and dangerous. It was a duel, not with pistols, but with integrity. Julian looked at the stairs. They looked like a mountain. He looked at the screen of his phone. The comments on his live stream were changing. "Go up there. Show him the proof. Why is he scared? Julian looks like he's gonna puke." The tide was turning. The digital mob, fickle as the wind, was smelling blood. But this time, it wasn't George's blood they were sniffing. Julian looked around for support, but the people at his table were leaning away from him, creating a physical distance. He was isolated. I don't need to go up there," Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "The internet knows. The story is trending. You're finished." George didn't flinch. He just shook his head slowly. "The internet is a mile wide and an inch deep, son, and you're drowning in it." George turned to the AV team. "Put the camera on this," he commanded, holding the yellow slip of paper out flat. The cameraman zoomed in. The image on the giant screens blurred for a second, then sharpened. It was a deposit slip, dated that very morning, 8 a.m. Bank of San Antonio. The amount was staggering. It wasn't just the fee for the night, it was 5 times the fee. And the recipient wasn't an offshore account. It was clearly printed, Wounded Warrior Project, Direct Building Fund. Beneath it there was a handwritten note in blue ink, the penmanship jagged and bold. "For the new wing, sell the Rhone and the Bay to cover the rest. GS." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It started in the front row and rippled back like a wave. George lowered the paper. "I sold my 2 best cutting horses this morning," he said, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to suppress. "I didn't want a press release. I didn't want a gala. I just wanted the hospital built. My manager didn't even know yet." He looked back at Julian. The blogger was pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. The phone in his hand, his weapon, suddenly looked like a toy. "You saw money moving," George said, his voice quiet again, deadly serious. "You saw a large withdrawal and you assumed the worst because that's how your mind works. You assumed greed because that's all you know. You didn't bother to check where it was going. You just wanted the kill." George took a step toward the edge of the stage, towering over the table where Julian sat. "Now," George said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You have about 10 seconds to apologize." "Not to me, I don't care what you think of me. You apologize to the veterans in this room for using their pain to try and make yourself famous." The room turned to Julian. 3,000 pairs of eyes. The weight of the judgment was crushing. The silence was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop. Julian stood up, his legs shaking. He looked at his phone. The stream was flooded with angry emojis. He had lost. He looked at George, standing there like an Old Testament prophet in a tuxedo. But before Julian could speak, before he could offer a weasel-worded apology, a slow clapping started from the back of the room. Clap, clap, clap. George looked up. It was Elias. The waiter had put down his tray. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, clapping his hands. Then the man at table 1, the one who had tried to leave earlier, stood up. He started clapping too. Then a woman. Then a table. But George didn't smile. He wasn't done. He raised his hand, silencing the applause instantly. He wasn't looking for praise. He was looking for justice. He kept his eyes locked on Julian. "I'm waiting, son," George said. The silence that followed George's demand for an apology was heavy enough to crack the foundation of the hotel. Julian stood there, trapped in the glare of the house lights, stripped of his digital armor. He looked at his phone screen one last time. The chat room on his live stream, which had been his cheering section only minutes ago, had turned into a firing squad. "You lied? Unsubscribe. You came for the king and you missed." The metrics were plummeting. His empire of clicks was dissolving into pixelated dust. Julian looked up at George, then at the audience. He opened his mouth, but the apology wouldn't come. His ego, swollen by years of unchecked online validation, choked him. Instead of humility, a flash of desperate, rat-like anger crossed his face. He grabbed his glass of champagne, his hand trembling violently, and slammed it down on the table. The glass shattered, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet room. "It doesn't matter," Julian screamed, his voice cracking, high and hysterical. "You're all dinosaurs. You think this piece of paper matters? The headline is already out. The algorithm already chose the winner. I still win because I made you look." It was a pathetic outburst, the final thrashing of a drowning man. George didn't shout back. He didn't even move. He just looked at Julian with a profound, weary sadness. He leaned into the microphone, his voice soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried to the back of the room. "Son," George said, "you didn't make me look. You made me see. And what I see is a man who is so poor all he has is money and attention." The crowd erupted. It wasn't polite applause this time. It was a roar of agreement, a release of the tension that had been strangling the room. The spell of the internet was broken by the undeniable reality of character. Security guards, sensing the shift in the room's energy and eager to distance themselves from the villain, moved in on table 4. 2 large men in black suits flanked Julian. They didn't touch him, but their presence was a clear directive. Julian looked around for an ally, but the people at his table had physically turned their chairs away, their backs forming a wall of rejection. Julian grabbed his phone, his lifeline, and scrambled away from the table. He didn't walk out with dignity. He scurried. He rushed toward the exit doors, the cameras tracking his retreat, broadcasting his cowardice to the very feed he had created. As the double doors swung shut behind him, cutting off his connection to the room, the atmosphere in the crystal ballroom instantly lightened. It was as if a window had been opened, letting out a noxious gas. George stood on stage, the yellow deposit slip still in his hand. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it carefully and placed it back in his pocket, right next to his heart. He looked out at the audience. The faces staring back at him were different now. The cynicism was gone. In its place was shame. Deep, palpable shame. The man in the second row, the one who had walked out earlier, was standing by the door, hesitating. He slowly walked back to his seat, his head lowered. A woman in the front row was wiping tears from her cheeks, her mascara smearing. They had been ready to crucify a legend based on a notification. They realized, in this moment of clarity, how fragile their own loyalty was. George reached for his guitar again. He slipped the strap over his shoulder. The weight of the wood felt good. It felt like forgiveness. "I didn't come here tonight to fight," George said, strumming a D chord that rang out clean and bright, washing away the memory of the feedback. "I came here to help build a place where broken things can be mended. Horses, men, spirits. He looked at the band. They were grinning now, their fear replaced by pride. They knew who they were playing for. "This next song," George said, "is about knowing when to stay and when to go. But mostly, it's about knowing who you are when the lights go out." He launched into The Cowboy Rides Away, but it wasn't the standard version. It was slower, more soulful. Every note was heavy with the night's emotion. When he sang the line, "And my heart is sinking like the setting sun," you could feel the exhaustion in his bones. But when he hit the chorus, the room joined in. Not for a selfie, not for a story. They sang because they needed to. They sang to apologize. As the final chord faded, hanging in the air like a prayer, the room didn't just clap. They stood. It was a standing ovation that wasn't mandatory. It was thunderous. It went on for 1 minute, then 2. George stood there nodding his thanks, tipping his hat. He didn't smile triumphantly, he just looked relieved. He unclipped the guitar and handed it to the tech. He waved to the band to take a bow. Then he walked to the edge of the stage, right where the stairs led down to the floor. He didn't head for the dressing room. He walked down the stairs into the crowd. The security detail rushed to form a perimeter, but George waved them off. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. Hands reached out to touch his sleeve, to shake his hand, murmuring apologies. "We're sorry, George. We should have known." George nodded to them, acknowledging their words, but not stopping. He had a destination. He walked past the high rollers tables. He walked past the governor of Texas. He walked straight to the service entrance near the kitchen. Elias, the young waiter, was standing there, holding a stack of dirty napkins, looking like he wanted to disappear into the wall. He had watched the whole thing, his heart in his throat. When he saw George Strait walking toward him, his eyes went wide. George stopped in front of the young Marine. The room went silent again, watching. The contrast was stark, the legend in the tuxedo and the kid in the stained uniform. "You stood tall, Marine," George said, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. I knew they were wrong, sir," Elias stammered. George reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out money, he pulled out a guitar pick. It was simple, white, with his signature printed on it in black. But then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a business card. It wasn't his agent's card. It was a card with the embossed horseshoe logo. Strait Ranch, Pearsall, Texas. "I'm firing my head of security at the ranch," George said, keeping a straight face. "He spends too much time on Facebook. I need someone who knows how to guard a flank and keep his mouth shut. I need someone who understands duty." Elias dropped the napkins. "Sir, pay is good, housing included, and you get to work with horses instead of..." George glanced over his shoulder at the ballroom. "Peacocks." Elias straightened his spine. The fatigue left his face. "I'd be honored, sir." George smiled, a real wide grin this time. He shook the boy's hand. "See you Monday, son." George turned and walked out the kitchen exit, bypassing the red carpet, the paparazzi, and the limo. He walked out the back door into the humid Houston alleyway where the dumpsters were kept. His manager, Frank, was waiting there with a rental Suburban, knowing better than to bring the limo around. "You okay, boss?" Frank asked, as George climbed into the passenger seat, loosening his bow tie. George leaned his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes. "Drive, Frank, just drive." The aftermath. The fallout was swift and brutal, but not for George. By the next morning, the Julian incident was the #1 trending topic globally, but not in the way the blogger had intended. The image of George holding the deposit slip became an instant meme, a symbol of receipts in the literal and metaphorical sense. The internet, in its chaotic justice, turned on Julian with a ferocity that made his initial attack look like child's play. Investigative journalists, spurred by George's challenge, dug into Julian's truth feed. Within 48 hours, they exposed a network of extortion where Julian would threaten celebrities with fake bad press unless they paid for consulting fees. The FBI got involved. Julian's site was seized. His verified checkmark was removed. He was, in every sense of the word, cancelled by the very machine he tried to pilot. But the real story wasn't the destruction of a villain. It was the construction of a sanctuary. The Wounded Warrior Project received a flood of donations that crashed their website 3 times in 1 week. The oil and tech billionaires, desperate to wash the stain of their doubt from their reputations, engaged in a bidding war to donate to the new wing. The initial goal of $2 million was surpassed in hours. They raised $20 million. The wing wasn't just built. It was a state-of-the-art complex, but George refused to have it named after him. He insisted it be named the Elias Rodriguez Center for Rehabilitation. 6 months later, the Texas sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and burnt orange. The air smelled of sagebrush and cooling earth. On the porch of the main house at the Strait Ranch, George sat in a rocking chair, a glass of iced tea in his hand. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing Wrangler jeans that had been washed 100 times, a plaid shirt with a fraying collar, and boots covered in dust. In the distance, down by the newly painted fences of the rehabilitation center, he could see figures moving. Veterans, men and women missing limbs, missing pieces of their souls, learning to ride, learning to trust something big and powerful again. He saw a young man leading a skittish mare around the round pen. The man moved with a quiet confidence, his hand steady on the halter. It was Elias. He looked healthier now, the pallor of the hotel kitchen replaced by a tan, his shoulders broad and relaxed. He was talking to the horse, his voice low and soothing. George took a sip of his tea. His phone was inside the house, probably sitting on the kitchen counter with a dead battery. He hadn't checked it in days. He heard the screen door creak open behind him. Norma, his wife of 50 years, stepped out. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You thinking about that night?" she asked softly. George watched Elias laugh as the mare nuzzled his pocket for a treat. "No," George said. "I'm thinking about today." He looked out at the horizon, where the land met the sky in an unbroken line. The digital world was out there somewhere, buzzing and screaming, eating itself alive in a frenzy of noise. But here, on the dirt, under the gaze of God, the only thing that mattered was what you did with your hands and your heart. The lie had traveled around the world before the truth had got its boots on, but the truth, George realized, didn't need to race. The truth was the ground. It was always there, waiting for you to fall so it could catch you. He set the tea down. "I think I'll go down there," George said, standing up. "That mare has a sticky gait. Elias might need a hand." "George," Norma smiled. "He knows what he's doing. You taught him." "I know," George winked, putting on his hat. "But a cowboy's work is never done." He walked down the steps, his boots crunching on the gravel, walking away from the house, away from the fame, and toward the work. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long shadow that stretched out before him, not as a darkness but as a path. The king of country was just a man again, and that was the greatest title of all.